Book TV.
Zaheer Ali, what was your involvement in this book, Malcolm X?
Well, my involvement in the book Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention began before the book's life began, as one of Dr. Marable's doctoral students. I came to him as part of my program in the PhD program in history at Columbia University, and I was interested in researching the history of the Nation of Islam in Harlem, Temple Number 7. And when he heard this, his eyes opened up, a smile came across his face, and he said, "You have to work with me." And he told me that he had for years been wanting to do work on Malcolm X. And because of his duties as director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies, which he founded at Columbia, he had not really had a chance to get involved in it. But shortly after I started, he commenced working on a comprehensive research project on the life of Malcolm X called the Malcolm X Project. And I worked with him in several capacities on that project. One as the associate director of the project for 4 years, then as one of the lead researchers on the projects, and of course as one of his teaching assistants for his Malcolm X course. So all of those activities fed into the work that would become this book.
What is there about this book that's different than the co-authored Alex Haley autobiography of Malcolm X?
Well, anyone who sets out to do any work on Malcolm X has to contend with the autobiography of Malcolm X. It's such a powerful, looming voice in the studies on Malcolm X. But the autobiography of Malcolm X is a powerful literary story of personal transformation. It is not a historical study of Malcolm's life. Certainly there were aspects of Malcolm's experiences that he had no idea about when he was writing the autobiography. In addition, when he worked on the autobiography, he set out initially to write a book that would demonstrate the transformative power of the Nation of Islam in his life. And so certain aspects of his life, pre and post Nation of Islam, were highlighted or emphasized or de-emphasized to highlight the contrast between his pre-Nation of Islam life and his post-Nation of Islam life. And then there was the filter of the voice of Alex Haley, who as a liberal Republican integrationist was not a fan of Malcolm X's politics as a black nationalist or Pan-Africanist, and really saw in Malcolm's story a cautionary tale for a white America, in the sense, this is what happens if you don't fix the race problem. And that isn't really the best frame, Dr. Marable felt, to understand Malcolm's development, his political development, his faith development, his relationship with Africa and the Middle East, which is not covered at all in the autobiography, the level of surveillance that he was under by the federal and state agencies of the FBI and the New York Police Department, respectively. So these are all insights that are missing from the autobiography of Malcolm X. What Dr. Marable accomplishes in this book is giving us not only the life of Malcolm, but the social architecture that framed that life.
Were archives and records available that Dr. Marable used for this that weren't available before?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that question. This, well, there hasn't really been an attempt to do a comprehensive bio on Malcolm for over 20 years. I think the last major attempt to do a biography on Malcolm was Bruce Perry's book in 1991. And so there hasn't been much work done on Malcolm for that long. In doing this book, Dr. Marable took advantage of material that had become available only in the last 5 to 10 years. He's one of the first scholars to engage Malcolm's travel diaries, which gives us a richer understanding of Malcolm's experiences abroad that were instrumental in his political and religious development. This book is one of the first to engage the Manhattan District Attorney's case file on the assassination of Malcolm, highlighting some of the unanswered questions that linger around Malcolm X's assassination and what other agencies may or may not have known about it in advance. This book also is, I think, the only only book to utilize speeches that Malcolm gave within the Nation of Islam context. Much of what people understand about Malcolm has been based on speeches that were made available after his death, speeches that he gave in the last few months of his life that were from the time he left the Nation of Islam in March of 1964, or maybe slightly before. But very little had been known about what Malcolm X said as a minister, as a pastor, as an administrator of the Nation of Islam for the 12 years that he was a member of the Nation of Islam. And Dr. Marable, I think, gives us a fuller picture of the level of work that Malcolm put in, traveling the country, speaking and organizing, building temples on behalf of the Nation of Islam. So these are just some of the, and this is based on the archives that he had available. So I think these are some of the new and fresh insights that are in the book based on those archives.
Zaheer Ali, are there some archives about Malcolm X that are still not available or released?
Well, yes, there are thousands of pages of FBI documents and New York Police Department documents. In his research, Dr. Marable utilized over 6,000 pages of newly declassified material through Freedom of Information Act requests. Just this last month, the FBI put on their website a new batch of FBI files on Malcolm X. So there is still much more to be known about what our government knew about Malcolm, what they thought about Malcolm, and how involved they were in his organizations. One of the interesting things we found is that Malcolm, the first page of his FBI file began in 1950 while he was in prison. He had just come into the teachings of the Nation of Islam, but he had written a letter to President Truman protesting the Korean War. And based on that letter, the FBI began their file on him, the first file. Another interesting insight in terms of how deeply embedded the FBI was in all of the organizations Malcolm was involved in. In 1954, when Malcolm is traveling the country, setting up temples for the Nation of Islam, he's in Boston holding a small meeting in a family home. Maybe 10 or 12 people in attendance. One of them was an FBI informant who reported on the meeting. This is in 1954, before the Nation of Islam had received any publicity or much publicity at all, before it had achieved the numbers that it had achieved. So that is how early and how deeply embedded the Nation of Islam was, the FBI was in the Nation of Islam. So, that raises some of the questions that I think Dr. Marable asked us about what more can we learn when these files, gradually as they become more and more available. And then, of course, much of what's available is redacted, which means people's names and certain identities are crossed out or blacked out. And so as a scholar, you kind of have to see what you can corroborate with other materials. The FBI would have certain reports on meetings that Malcolm had, where we could corroborate those reports with newspaper accounts, with oral histories, with other accounts to try to figure out who they were talking about when they were redacting. So these are some of the things that we still have to learn about Malcolm X, but I think this book makes a significant contribution towards that objective.
The subtitle, A Life of Reinvention, where did that come from?
This comes from, Malcolm went through several stages in his evolutionary development. He was born Malcolm Little, and throughout his life, his father was killed by many killed by what many believe to be racist violence of the Black Legion, which was a kind of Ku Klux Klan organization in the Midwest in the 1920s. His family fell apart as a result of that, and he was sent to a foster home. In eighth grade, his teacher kind of dashed his dreams of becoming a lawyer, saying that was unrealistic for him as a Black child. So he kind of loses his enthusiasm for school, and he was a great student. He was elected class president. And then he moves to Boston and lives with his sister, Ella Collins, and takes on the persona Detroit Red. He wasn't from Detroit Red, he was from Lansing, Michigan, but Detroit was, a better city. And so he becomes Detroit Red and participates in the kind of hep cat culture of the time. He becomes a bit of a petty criminal. And then, of course, he goes to prison. And while he's in prison, he encounters through his siblings the Nation of Islam's teachings and takes on the name Malcolm X The X was, in the Nation of Islam's tradition, given to its members to signify their lost identity that was taken from them during slavery, and that was the name that he came to prominence with. And then he, when he left the Nation of Islam, he went to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage, which is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and earning the title El Hajj. Malik Shabazz was the Arabic name that he then was publicly known by. And so these are several stages of Malcolm's evolutionary development as his political ideas begin to grow and evolve, as his religious faith deepens. But even through these reinventions or recastings that he undergoes, there are some consistent characteristics about Malcolm. He remains someone who's incredibly defiant in challenging all forms of authority, from his parents as Malcolm Little to the prison authorities as Malcolm X, and then coming out in the Nation of Islam, challenging the authority structure in the Nation of Islam at times, and then certainly as El-Hajj Malik Shabazz, wanting to bring the United States before the World Court at the United Nations for its human rights violations of the rights of African Americans. So he was someone who was always challenging authority. He was someone who was deeply disciplined and committed and had incredible integrity throughout much of his life. So even though he goes through these changes that signify political and spiritual identification, there are certain core characteristics that I think are consistent throughout.
This book published in April of 2011. Dr. Marable died when?
Dr. Marable sadly, unexpectedly passed on April 1st, 2011, and the book was released on April 4th. He was someone who was a scholar and an activist. He had written over 20 books focusing on African American history, politics, black leadership, the criminal justice system, Hurricane Katrina and its aftermath, the leadership of President Obama. He viewed all of his academic or intellectual projects as social justice interventions. And he was very excited about this book because he hoped that this book would reignite interest in Malcolm X and the issues that Malcolm X represent, that this book would cause people to revisit the ideas of Pan-Africanism and Islam that Malcolm so deeply was committed to, and he hoped that the conversations around this book would cause people to want to reopen and re-examine the case and circumstances that led to Malcolm's assassination. So for him, this was not just a book to peddle. This was an opportunity to have very important conversations around the life and legacy of Malcolm X.
Well, Zaheer Ali, one of the critiques of this book is that Dr. Marable made assumptions about Malcolm X's life.
Well, I think what Dr. Marable sought to do was give us as comprehensive a portrait of Malcolm's life as was available based on the sources he consulted. And as a researcher, I think he was very careful. He was very, he wouldn't base anything that he wrote on just one source. He tried to corroborate as much as he could with multiple sources. And in addition, I think it's important to note that he grappled with what he found about Malcolm. There were certain things about Malcolm's life that he was absolutely in awe of. And there were certain things about Malcolm's life that he had criticisms of. And then there were certain things that he felt that we just needed to understand the complexity of Malcolm as a human being. In a sense, this book is a kind of iconoclasm. It challenges the iconography of Malcolm. It challenges the iconography of the autobiography of Malcolm X, and kind of takes Malcolm off of the pedestal so we can see him as a human being as he struggled through the political and religious currents in which he worked.
Did the Shabazz family participate in the research on this book, or were they willing to talk with Dr. Marable?
Early on, Dr. Marable worked with the Shabazz family in an early project on the Malcolm X project. And in fact, Dr. Marable was instrumental utilizing his influence at Columbia University to help reopen the site that was at the Audubon, the former site of the Audubon Ballroom, which is now the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial Center, because Columbia was a part owner of that site. And so Dr. Marable felt very deeply towards making sure that Malcolm and his family deserved justice and the kind of memorial that was worthy of Malcolm's work. As a historian, he also felt committed to, again, giving us a comprehensive portrait of Malcolm in all his humanity. And understandably, this is not a hagiography. This is not a saint story. And Malcolm would have been the first to tell us he was no saint. And I think Dr. Marable's portrait of Malcolm, even with his human complexity, is one that is still sympathetic, it's critical, but it still gives us Malcolm as a deeply compelling figure.
Zaheer Ali, what's your background?
I am a researcher and student at Columbia University who's been as enthralled with Malcolm probably since high school when I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and throughout college and now graduate school, much of my research have focused on the history of Islam in America, especially in the African American community.
Where are you from?
My family's from Trinidad, and I grew up in Maryland outside the Washington, D.C. area.
So now that the book is finished, what are you doing today?
I am, unfortunately, Dr. Marable was the chair of my dissertation and advisor for my dissertation. So I'm in the process of reconstituting my committee and looking forward to do something that he was committed to seeing me do, and that is complete my PhD program at Columbia.
And we've been talking with Zaheer Ali about Manning Marable's last book, Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tom Allen is president of the American